What is it like to build in a Kolink Rocket Complex case, and can the former flagship 2080 Ti still hang tough as we enter space year 2026? Let's find out. Welcome to Esk Computers, I'm Scott, and today on the desk of Esk I'm rebuilding a system I put together months ago and then somehow bricked the motherboard while turning secure boot on. Attempting to fix that will be the subject of another video, probably. Here I'm just replacing it with another of the Jinwei B350i ITX motherboards that will be familiar to viewers of the first video on this channel. I named this Nervous Rocket in no small part because the case is a Kolink Rocket Complex, a stunning looking 20-litre steel, anodised aluminium and tempered glass ITX case with a tiny footprint of 215 by 213mm, although it somewhat makes up for that in its 450mm height and 4.5 kilos of weight. GPUs can be up to 2.8 slots thick and 330mm in length, housed on either side of the spine and fed by an included PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. I think this looks amazing. Its primary drawback is that it ships with screws on the PSU and radiator brackets that will strip their heads off as soon as you look at them, so be careful unless you enjoy drilling screws out around sensitive electrical components. The other downside of, well, pretty much every small case is that cable management is difficult, as there's no space in which to perform said cable management. The sensible way around this is to minimise the amount of cables used, but we're including 2 SATA SSDs and ARGB here because I am a glutton for punishment. Well, let's see how we get on. I'm fairly sure it's just the old motherboard that was bricked, but it always makes sense to check the main components are working before building it up. The B350i is an AM4 motherboard with 2 4-pin ARGB headers, 2 PWM fan connectors and 2 3-pin fan headers. I'll be using 2 of the 4 SATA 3 ports and the full PCIe 3x4 speed NVMe slot on the front. There's another NVMe slot on the backside of this board, but puzzlingly it's only been given a PCI 2x2 interface, so that's going unused. Into this goes a Ryzen 7 5700X, which is an 8-core 16-thread part that's a few generations old but is still hanging in there with more modern parts. This is cooled by a Thermalright Aqua Elite 240 ARGB liquid CPU cooler, and I really need to get a test cooler, but I suppose it has to be installed at some point even if it makes it a bit of a mess just testing it here. When in the case, overclocked and battering out a full CPU and GPU load, this CPU can get up to the high 80s, but that's still within spec, while drawing 500 watts from the wall. I'm adding 2 8GB sticks of Team Group 8-pack DDR4 memory, which is rated at 4000 MHz, but I can only get this booting reliably at 3600 MHz on this board. A slight performance hit I'd imagine, but still plenty fast enough. All of this is fed by a 600-watt Metalfish SMX PSU. The graphics card for this is the 2080 Ti. This is the EVGA Black Edition, although the more observant amongst you will see this did not come with the fans and shroud, requiring a few creative modifications with some 120mm ARGB fans and some cable ties. It somehow performs better than the stock cooler from what I can find, so a victory for function over form. Stressing this out in Furmark had it balancing out at around 75 degrees centigrade after 10 minutes. Speaking of storage, there's a fast 512GB Kusu NVMe SSD for the operating system, and out of curiosity I've taken 2 Covner Garden 1TB Silicon Power A55 SATA SSDs and combined them into a 2TB striped storage pool in Windows. Speeds are pretty good at 1078 megabits per second read and 979 megabits per second write, although this will get slower as it fills up, and of course the NVMe drive blows that out of the water at 3059 megabits per second read and 1296 megabits per second write. Let's get this installed. This would be a little easier if I could remove the radiator carrier, but that's how I know how easily these screws destroy themselves. However, once you figure out the best way to get at the various screws and realise that some really require a longer shafted screwdriver than is usual, it's reasonably straightforward. This bendy screwdriver extension also comes in clutch. I'd left the SSDs and the PCIe riser cable installed from the last ride of this case. I don't think either caused huge issues as long as the riser cable goes in before the motherboard, as it's a bit tight to fit otherwise. Cable management is hampered by there being essentially no provision for it at all. If these SSDs weren't installed, then that would provide some holes to cable tie and tidy, but with them installed it's just tension and good vibes keeping the power and SATA cables and AIO tubing out of the way of the radiator fans. This is as good as I could do. Not my finest hour, but I challenge you to do better. Here's one motherboard oddity I forgot to mention during the previous coverage. Windows 11 refuses to properly install to any NVMe drive I have access to on this system. Windows 10, fine. Ubuntu, no issues. Windows 11, weird driver errors and no boot. It can, however, install fine to a SATA drive and then be cloned over to the NVMe drive. So we get there in the end, but very strange. I'm using Windows 11 IoT Enterprise Edition for a debloated experience with OpenRGB installed for lighting control, along with Ryzen Master and the NVIDIA app for automated overclocking on the CPU and GPU. There's a lot of screws involved in getting the aluminium panels back on, so much so that my camera ran out of battery juice and I'd finished before realising. But I think you've seen quite enough screwing, missus, so let's see how this performs in our usual test suite. Either the cooler or the silicon lottery has let this Ryzen chip spread its wings with a single core Cinebench 2024 score of 94 and a multi-core score of 835, showing great performance. Synthetics on the 2080 Ti also coming in with some pretty strong results. 3D Mark's Firefly gets us 31,085 points, TimeSpy 13,997 points, and Unigen's Superposition 19,637 points at 1080p high settings. Seeing as this is ray tracing capable, I've also thrown 3D Mark's Port Royale at it, where it comes back with 8,974 points. So, on to the proper games now. I suppose it's a bit of a formality pitting this former flagship against older games, so it's no surprise that Shadow of the Tomb Raider gets 174 average FPS at 1080p high settings, and Counter-Strike 2 gets 253 average frames per second at 1080p very high settings. So it's absolutely smashing older games and esports titles, and will of course obliterate your Minecrafts, Dotas, Robloxes, PUBGs and Fortnites. Let's crank up the difficulty levels with Cyberpunk 2077 without any ray tracing. Using the 1080p ultra settings gave us a tremendous 119 average frames per second, and if you'd rather increase the eye candy, with the 1080p ray traced ultra settings, this benchmark run gives an average of 62 frames per second. There's life in this old dog yet. I always come back to Unreal Engine 5 games as a litmus test of whether a GPU is going to have legs. The Black Myth Wukong benchmark gives us 77 average frames per second at 1080p high settings with no frame gen, and Marvel Rivals gives us 103 average frames per second at 1080p medium settings without any upscaling or frame generation. So happily the 2080 Ti is still giving playable results, albeit very similar scores to a modern RTX 5060. Horizon Zero Dawn is normally my representative sample of a bad PlayStation port, but at least it usually functions. For reasons I could not fathom, it was tripping out my cheapo capture card with his psychedelic display, and then crashing when changing the graphics settings. It did make it through a run at its default, mostly ultra settings at 1080p with 121 average frames per second, but it's obviously bugging out for some probably fixable reason, but I don't have time to troubleshoot all of that. The engine used for the Assassin's Creed games is actually pretty competent, and scales well as far as I've tested it. We're looking at Mirage here, where it's casually knocking out 129 average frames per second at 1080p high settings. Cranking that up to ultra still gives us 99 average frames per second, so definitely going pretty well in this game. Forza Horizon 5 uses an even better engine, so no surprises that it's also running really well here. It defaults to the extreme settings at 1080p, where it gives us an 84 frames per second average. Tremendous. Red Dead Redemption 2 is also not presenting much of a problem at 1080p, with the settings on the lower end balanced, giving 114 average frames per second, and pushing the slider up into the quality settings gives us 91 average frames per second, so plenty of headroom for higher resolutions if you desire. I think I'm going to send Call of Duty Warzone testing to the Gulag. From tests on the previous version of this machine before it broke, I expect to get somewhere between 80 and 100 frames per second at 1080p extreme settings, depending on what you're doing, and this seemed about right on this recorded play session, although the Nvidia app wasn't counting frames at all. Then it decided that it couldn't be bothered loading textures halfway through a map, and then the controls started glitching out, continually swapping weapons, jumping and parachuting all over the place. I have no idea how I managed to get a kill with all this going on, but I think that will likely be my last. Certainly on this build, as it's now degraded from starting extremely slowly to not starting at all, giving a similar DirectX error to the 5080 build of a few weeks ago that fixed itself after a few weeks. Frankly, this game is a buggy mess, and even when it does reliably start, it seems to continually want to install multi-gigabyte updates, and for a game this mid, it's more trouble than it's worth. Still, for the purposes of this test, yes, when it does properly launch and not fall apart, it can play it pretty well. Why you'd want to at this stage is another question. Actually, I couldn't resist trying again just before posting this video. It looked to be working well again after another multi-gigabyte update, before crashing out halfway through. Get in the bin, Warzone. So, thoughts on the Rocket Complex case. You're welcome to disagree, but I think it's a really great looking case, and it's a proper statement piece. It can hold powerful hardware, albeit only in ITX form, but it can hold all but the beefiest graphics card, and there's plenty of scope for this being relevant well into the future. I can't really test the airflow, but this configuration is not having any problems being kept cool. The downsides are that the motherboard and GPU ports all wind up being on the bottom of the case and are practically inaccessible in normal use, ameliorated somewhat by the USB 3A and C ports up top. A more serious concern is the simply not fit for purpose screws that are used on the internal mounts that cannot stand up to normal use, let alone abuse. If I do another build in this, I'd be looking to replace them. I can forgive this, in the main because this case, with the riser cable included, cost me £20 on clearance, which is an absolute steal. I don't think you'd be able to get as good a deal these days, but it was worth that for the riser cable alone. At its list price of £90, or the current eBay price of £110, it's a much harder sell, but I've still occasionally seen this appear new from eBay sellers at around £40, which is a price I'd be happy with. As for the 2080 Ti at the 1080p resolution, resolutions I've been testing at to compare with the more budget-orientated builds I've been looking at of late, it's still knocking out of the park with no qualifications. If anything, I've not been asking enough of it in these tests. With results like this, I should be looking at 4K for the older games and 1440p with newer ones. Of course, newer, faster cards are available, and if you have pockets deep enough, but unless you're fixated on pushing the newest, most demanding games at the highest resolutions and frame rates, there's little need to upgrade yet. It will be interesting to see if this is as long-lived as its legendary predecessor, the 1080 Ti, or if more reliance on fancier ray tracing will bring about its early demise, if indeed you could say such a thing about a card released 7 years ago. At the £200 I picked this up for, it's hard to argue with the value. Whether we get similar results from the 5060 or Intel's B580 if you're buying new, you'll be paying about an extra 50 quid. That might make it worth it for the warranty, but if you're happy with used parts, well, this will make you happy. So yes, a very solid build, I'm very happy with this one, and if you have any thoughts on this, please consider posting a comment down below, and if you enjoyed this Videotronic missive, then please consider subscribing. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.